Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. Today is another redo on virtual reality, right? I'm going to continue redoing a few of these as I see them, but the VR one, I did it, and I was doing it more on a topical sort of 60,000 foot view and not really getting into what's going on today. So I want to bring it up and make it a little more relevant than it was. And I'll kind of go through some of the stuff I went on, obviously, on the first episode, then hopefully add some stuff that I didn't talk about first time through. So when I do a show like this, I'm wondering, well, who's going to watch this? People who have dabbled in a little bit of VR and people who have never, ever seen virtual reality in their lifetime. So the thing is I'm going to get a crowd of people that are very interested, and they have, tip of the iceberg, early adopter, bleeding edge experiences, and I'm going to get folks that are super hungry to know what this is about but haven't done it. So I will preface this with, please have patience for each other as we kind of go through this little virtual reality conference here. But here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about essentially what it is, where it started, various evolutions in the thought process of it, which I think I meandered a little too much in the first version. The next thing we're going to get into is the first time it ever existed, which is pretty much around 1990, and sort of the 5-year evolution it went through before it died. And then we're going to talk about where it is today and some of the areas you can find some interest in, because I think it's pretty darn cool. So what is virtual reality? I know a lot of you know what this is, but just bear with me here for a second. Virtual reality today is anything you can do to convince the ears and the eyes that they are in a reality that simply isn't occurring around you, whether it be a videotape of a real environment in the world at a different point in time, or whether or not we create a computer-generated world that has never existed. That's your basic definition of today. And of course, it is a combination of audio and visual. Right? How do we get the image in the eye? That kind of thing. Now, what I like to remind you guys is the first virtual realities any of us knew, to be honest, were when we were little kids playing with Hot Wheels. Maybe some of you girls play with some dollies. And when we created little worlds, Lego worlds, and that kind of stuff that didn't really exist, but our brains usurped what we were looking at as reality. That's when we first really engaged what we call imagination, right? The beauty of virtual reality is that it's going to be a medium by which imagination will be engaged at a level that it starts to utterly and completely replace your senses, right? Your 5 senses. It's going to take a little while. And I'm going to go through some of the inventions that I have bumped into in my lifetime so that you know. Now, the very first time in my knowledge that a virtual reality was ever really portrayed in a very literal manner was in the movie Tron from 1982. Now, one might argue they didn't call it a virtual reality, and there was no one sitting in the real world looking into a fake world with some type of apparatus around us, but in the purest form, a virtual reality would be your whole human body, soul, flesh, and everything gets yanked into a computer, which is completely simulated, and you live inside the computer. That would be the purest form of a virtual reality. Sort of your own little simulator, like you're going into the video game. So for me, that is very interesting, because Tron was 1980 to 82 production cycle. The guys who made it had thought about it for 5 years before it happened. So these dudes were way ahead of their time, and this is what LSD and great psychotropic drugs can do for you. But it comes out in August of 1982, and people, I say this all the time in the show, but you have to understand, 1982, probably less than 5% of households had a computer. Less than 5% of computers in households. All right, and the processor powers were pretty much, spreadsheet sort of things. Any video game you played was usually a text-based video game, like a Zork 1. But what's interesting is that movie comes and it goes. And it takes a long time for it to sort of gain this cult following, and it really got cult following in the 80s after the movie came out, with some of the video games, both the video games we played in our house and the video games we played in arcades. And again, it comes out on VHS. Then it comes on beta VHS. Then eventually starts moving up through the DVD ranks, and is now most definitely a complete craze, especially since the relaunch with Legacy in 2010, right? But now let's get into where virtual reality really started as a hardware experience. And I'm not going to go look up the vendor names because that's just pointless. But by the 1990s, very early 1990s, you had what is known as Oculus, that type of interface, this headset, completely thought out. We also had a VR glove, where you put it on your hand and it mocapped your hand. And so that allowed you to reach up and touch things, right? And I believe the glove used fiber optic wires and the degradation of light bending around a corner to figure out how much this thing was bent in a particular direction. I think that's how they worked back in the day. Pretty cool, except for every single unit of anything that you wanted to buy was about 10 grand a pop. I had a former employer of mine come at me pretty heavy to start getting into this, and so I spent a lot of time researching where everything was, and I got pulled into an experience that was pretty darn cool at Sun Microsystems, I think about 92, 93. And Scott McNeely was the CEO at the time. I'm not sure he's still the CEO or not anymore, but he was there. It was right by his office, and it was called the holodeck cave, right? But you walked in this, it's what we call a cave. You walk in, and all the walls around you are being projected on. In this particular situation, they had projectors. It was all transparent screens, I believe, and they were projecting on the other side of the wall from where I was standing. And you were elevated up so that the wall in front of you, this is very typical VR setup, you have a wall in front of you, which obviously is going to have to rest on the floor, but we don't want to project on the floor. And so they have to lift you up on a platform so that when you stare down, you're still staring at the wall in front of you, right? I can't remember if they tried to project on the floor or not. It was pretty damn cool. I think they were projecting from behind, but they could have been projecting from within the room I was in. But it was seamless. And I walked in the room, and it was the first time I'd experienced what's called active glasses. And anytime you need to see 3D, you know that there's a few ways that could be done, right? Back in the old days, they used to have the the blue and the red, and you would go into the movie theater in the 50s, and one of the images on the screen was red, one of the images was blue, and only those frequencies can get into your left and right eye, and that created stereo. Now, what a lot of you don't know is that the passive glasses that we use right now when we go to movie theaters, not the ones that are chromy, but they were invented in the 1950s. But it took 30 years for them to get used in the 80s for things like Friday the 13th, Part 3 in 3D, Jaws 3 in 3D, and a few others. But these were active. And what active glasses are is essentially you take a liquid crystal lens and you shock it with electricity. And when that happens, you align a chemical structure of wood, jeez, very small rocks, of metal shards, and they essentially turn in alignment with the poles of the electricity, and that allows them to blind one eye, let one eye see, and then flip it, blind, and flip it. And so that allows them to control what goes in one eye versus the other. And so the screen is literally flickering left eye, right eye frames at 120 frames a second, and typically your eyeball pulls it in at 60 frames a second, and the illusion's complete. And so I walk into this thing, and you have to remember that computers were very primitive at the time, but Sun Microsystems made something called a Mini. And for those of you who don't remember or don't know, you had these giant mainframes like the computers that were in the movie Tron in 82, and then you had these little tiny dinky personal computers like the Apple and the TRS-80 and the Texas Instruments computers. But then you had something in the middle, which was a much larger, it was about the size of maybe like a 3-foot square box, and they called it a Mini. It had multiple processors, pretty darn quick, and it would run, usually at the time, it would run things like stores like Walmart and Target and Safeway. They'd have a Mini in the back running all the registers, making everything happen when people scan stuff in, right? But they had rigged up a bunch of Minis in the other room, and they were running these processors. And so Sun Microsystems was also very close to another very famous company called Silicon Graphics, which was essentially the very first hardware company, publicly owned, well, maybe not publicly owned, but in the public's eye, that had a render farm technology, these computers called Predators. It's what Jurassic Park was made on. It's what T2 was made on, all the first real CG-heavy movies. But its son, they knew that virtual reality was coming. And so the first thing that happens when I walked in this thing was I was in the ocean. And I was sailing out. The camera basically goes out over a lake, and there's a guy sitting there fishing, which oddly looked like Jaws. And then it dips the camera down into the water, which gives you the total feeling that you're going to drown because your body doesn't know how to reconcile this, right? And they took advantage of every single processing limitation that they had to sort of coordinate the animation to make it look realistic. So the fog shroud of water was pretty easy for them to do. It was only the polygon count that was really tough to do. And so all these fish, little tiny fish, started swimming by me. Felt completely real. And then they let a beat in the script go, and then what looks like a little fish is coming. And it's the same geometry as the little fish, except this thing was really far away, and he's shrouded. And here he comes. And they've zoomed him up to whale size. Still silly artwork, but it didn't matter. My mind thought that a giant beast had just swam by me, right? Swum. I like that word. There's two other phases. One of them, there was a lathe that they put out in front of me, and it was a spinning cylinder. And the guy then tells me to wave my hand out there. And I'm assuming they had some sort of tracking system in the room, but I could lathe this thing with my hand, and it would cut just like a lathe. And eventually, when you cut it down past the center, which I did, it broke and spun into the room. It was pretty interesting. He ended that phase. But the last thing he did was pretty damn interesting, and this pales in comparison to the stuff that we see today, right? And I'm going to mention a few of these ideas, or a few of these other products, right? But we had this the simulation of a mud skipper, like one of those swamp runner things with the big fan. I forgot what you call them, but we're in this swamp. It's daytime, and now there's large blades of grass going by the boat and kind of wrapping around the hole. And there's, I'm down inside the swamp, so I'm below sea level, it looks like, and I look around, there's the horizon all around me, blue skies. Pretty cool simulation. But I can start to see, it's got a limited polygon count, and it looks like a computer. The more they leave you in the simulation, the more your brain starts going, okay, this isn't real. No sooner does it start feeling not real that they drop the lights on this simulation, slamming it into nighttime with a lightning bolt that struck in the soundtrack and over in the horizon. And now everything is either black or a sunrise. And when that happened, because silhouettes are the cheapest thing you can do in any sort of low-powered system, the thing looked utterly photoreal and creepy, because now I'm out in the middle of a swamp on a boat, and they blew out stars above me and that kind of stuff. So that's where the simulation ended. Remember, this is 23 years ago, right? No later than 23 years ago. So virtual reality was here a long time ago. And it didn't succeed because the form factors, meaning the gloves, the helmets, were simply too expensive. They required really powerful computers to run. And we're sort of seeing a bit of a repeat of that today, which I'm going to get into. So while this is going on, just so that you guys know, and I think I'm correct in saying there was an example of this technology in Jurassic Park, the first one. But everyone's familiar today with HTML. Everybody knows what that is. But back in the day, especially around 93, you may not have known there was another language called VRML, Virtual Reality Markup Language. And it tried to allow folks to build three-dimensional objects and three-dimensional worlds that you could sort of surf through within your browser. And I just happened to have a circle of friends in the Netscape team. And remember, Netscape was the first browser, the first server technology, and they were acquired by AOL and basically destroyed, right? Which is part of the larger group of people that run the world getting rid of all the small guys and getting rid of the inventors Typically, it's the way it usually happens, right? Yahoo creates the search engine, but who do you remember? A different group. Who's the CEO of Yahoo? Oh, from the other group, right? So they do this divide and conquer thing, and they're so good at it, right? So VRML had a couple limitations. One, again, the processor power on computers simply wasn't there to really make this experience amazing. Plus, when you have to transmit a 3D mesh, any sort of animation, and textures, which they were barely there at the very end. It's just simply too much for, we weren't even at 56K modems yet, right? 56K modem is where the old-fashioned modem topped out. They simply couldn't hang on. Using the telephone line, since it's so encrypted and so gross, they couldn't get anything to transmit over lines above 56K without a massive errors. And that's when we went to ISDN, and then we went to normal internet connections that we have today. But the other limitation, just as a little Paul Harvey for you guys, is that the engineers that were making VRML were first-time 3D programmers. And so here they are trying to create these little plugins within these browsers to do virtual reality, 3D models, and they simply didn't have any tricks up their sleeves, right? You got John Carmack in Texas creating Doom, Quake, geniuses at this stuff, but no one got the wherewithal to hire some of these brilliant guys to create, 3D engines for them. And so again, it just flopped. All right. So oddly, by at least 98, this stuff was dead. I mean, it was dead on an epic level. You had no one trying to create any sort of virtual reality experience. 3D in the movie theaters, it had also sort of died off. And then in the 21st century, something very interesting has occurred. You have a lot of improvements in technology. Smartphones being one of the major thrusts of this whole thing. Smartphones are responsible for two primary things occurring. One, the miniaturization of massive processors happened. And so, like I said, with the iPhone 4, you have a computer that I think is 1,000 times more powerful than the initial Cray computers that rendered the movie Tron in 1982. And I think that someone had said that the entire movie of Tron could have been rendered in just a few minutes on an iPhone 4. That's the Moore's law that just blows your mind, where the technology continues to get twice as fast, right? And I think with quantum computers rumored to be coming out in the next 5 to 10 years, you guys are going to see another massive improvement in processor power. But the other thing that happened was high-resolution retinal displays, as Apple would refer to it. So compacting LEDs so super tiny that you can no longer see a pixel on screen. Isn't that phenomenal? I think that most people could see a pixel on a monitor up until maybe 2005. And after that, you can't see them anymore, which is phenomenal. Now, that doesn't completely solve our problem with today's virtual reality goals, which I'm going to get into here. Now we have this major thrust that pretty much started in 2014 with the Oculus Rift coming out that Mark Zuckerberg and company purchased for Facebook, right? There's 3 major players in this space. 2 are very proprietary and require a tremendous amount of proprietary hardware and software to run. And 1 you carry with you every single day of your life. So let's go over the form factors really quickly here. The entry-level one is your telephone. If you have a widescreen telephone, either on the iPhone or on the Samsung side of things, you can get these Samsung Gear headsets, right? And they are simply designed to plug your phone in to the side of these button controls. So you have buttons on the outside. You slide your phone in, it becomes your screen. Now inside, when you look inside, you have 2 optical lenses that essentially reach out and grab as much of the screen as possible and shove it into your eyeball. Once you put this on, you have to put on a headset of choice. So they suggest headsets that are really small profile, headsets on your ear that cut out the outside ambient noise, and sort of like old 70s headsets, but they're beautiful, right? And I've worn these things in really loud environments, and they're pretty damn good, right? But there's a couple challenges in that as much as the screens are super high def when you look at them in your hand, I don't care how old you are, when you put them inside a Samsung Gear and the magnifying glass hits it, all of a sudden what was invisible becomes a pretty giant hexagon in your eyes. So you can start to see the pixels right away. You can see the microscopic welding, between the LEDs. However, as a lot of the manufacturers will attest, your brain sort of gives up on the photo reality that you're used to and surrenders to this pixelated reality. As long as the light quality is good, the dimensionality is good, meaning whoever's rendered the technology or rendered what you're looking at has done a good job, and if the sound obviously correlates with what you're seeing. Now, there are two types of experiences with these Samsungs. You have people who have created movies that are 3D, 360 movies, so stereo movies that go with 360, where you can put it on and you simply push play on the movie is all you're doing. You can then look around this movie in all 360 degrees and you get this amazing illusion. One of the really nice experiences out there is made by a new friend of mine, Kevin Mack, who's an Oscar award-winning special effects guy. He created something called the Zen Parade. If you have one of these systems, I would definitely suggest downloading Zen Parade and watching it. I saw it on a Galaxy Note 3, I believe. It looked fantastic, right? It's just to sit and watch, and it's hard to describe, but it's got a really cool group of these amoebic sort of creatures with these wild swimming textures on them going by you very slowly. You're way up in the sky, but there's nothing below you, so you don't get a sense that you're up high. It never does anything violent. It never does anything to surprise you. Now, if you know you have a telephone that can do this, but you don't have the money to buy the Samsung Gear, and you do own a pair of headsets, what you can do is buy I think it's like $12 or something like this. It's called the Google Cardboard. Just go on Amazon, look up Google Cardboard. What Google has done is very interesting, is they created a cardboard version of this headset thing. It's probably not that comfortable. I haven't put it on. But it allows you to put your phone and has the two optics in there, and you can have this experience for a much reduced cost. Now, it's nothing like the Samsung Gear experience. I will tell you in my experience that these headsets, even though they seem sort of light and you have adrenaline running and your dopamine running when you put them on, once you start to calm down, you're going to want a lot more from these experiences, for one thing. But it does give you a bit of a headache after about an hour. So that's something that's sort of a form factor challenge for the companies that are making these things, right? Now, the other two are the Oculus and the HTC Vive. I said it wrong in the episode. I said Valve because someone had just recently got it wrong in front of me and I accidentally repeated it, so I feel like an idiot. The Oculus Rift is, I believe, $700. The Vive is $800. Both of these systems require you have a PC desktop. They require that you install special software, that you've got to run it this way. Because of that, these particular form factors won't go very far, right? Right now, the Samsung Gear with your phone is going to go a lot better, a lot further, because it's less requirements on you, right? So the place that you're probably going to experience this is going to be virtual reality cafes in your local area. And it's definitely worth going down and paying some bucks to see it. It'll be very addictive for a little while. Between the two, of the Oculus and the Vive has the more thumbs up for one very specific reason, and that is that they've done a better job with the screen resolution inside. Their blacks are blacker, their whites are whiter, which is a huge part of the illusion, right? So the big question that people are asking is this here to stay this time, or is it another fad? Wall Street has been informed by investors that they're willing to put in $150 billion into this market of virtual reality, quote unquote, to see if it's going to take off. And that's a huge sum of money that was not invested in the 90s. And so I think for the very first time in a long time, we might actually be able to make it stick this time. But quite frankly, it's going to be individuals like you that make it stick or make it not stick, either by way of you being a devoted either by way of you being a devout consumer or using your degree in art school to go off and create some of this content. I will say this, it is very laborious to create really good content in this. And so if you thought that creating a 2D Hollywood special effects film was hard, wait till you start going into virtual reality, it becomes a lot more intense. And I'll tell you why. The two big players in this space for real theatrical level content is Nokia and a company called Jaunt. GoPro is into it, but GoPro has a lot of limitations for the way that their cameras are put together. So I want to describe to you the virtual reality cameras and what the challenges are so that you can understand them when you go into conversations about it. So the first idea is, well, geez, all we have to do is build a sphere with a bunch of cameras in it, one around the equator, a bunch around the equator, and a couple at the top and bottom. And then we just need to hold this thing on a stick and run around and do things. Well, you're almost there. That's about as far as the GoPro guys have thought it through without going to the next level. So, they may go to the next level a minute after I release this video. But what we have discovered with the GoPro stuff, and again, they're not trying to be theatrical, so they're hitting their market perfectly, okay? But they could get really serious about this. But the first big issue with these spherical cameras, and I'm going to go over the other two as well, is that the shutters that open and close or spin, because there's all kinds of different ways of doing it, they have to be in sync with each other between all the eyeballs. Because when this stuff is stitched together in software, if one of the lenses is closed and one of them is open, and you're trying to stitch the two together, you're going to have to wait till the next frame advances in one of the cameras and see if it stitches together. It becomes an utter mathematical nightmare. What you need to know about the stitching process is that there are a lot of low-hanging plugins. Adobe just came out with some VR updates to Photoshop, which I need to go take a look at in Premiere and After Effects. There's a company out there called Nuke. Actually, a company's called Foundry, but their product's called Nuke. They have plugins that can do a lot of the stitching, real generic stuff. And they do a pretty darn good job. But here's what you need to know. If you're shooting basic mono 2D 360 stuff, then the stitching algorithm is somewhat like Google Earth cameras to drive around, right? Or Google Map cameras to drive around. Now, if you've ever looked at Google Maps, you know that there are these weird fuzzy spots between takes because everyone's not holding still, and these shutters are all off on their own. So you might see half a human being's body, and then they're missing in the other part of their body, right? And that's because the two shutters that are opening and closing are out of sync with each other, right? So as far as I understand, the GoPro stuff hasn't synced up, and it's not fully manual, which is what you need in terms of shooting really theatrical content. So if you're going to go shoot some really cool surfing videos or whatever, just know you're going to have ripping and tearing between certain segments at times. If you are doing 2D, an anomaly in the stitching isn't terribly alarming to the mind, okay? But what if you really want to get into virtual reality 3D, especially 360 cameras? Here's the situation. Now you are coordinating in 360 degrees stereo images. So a left eye and a right eye version of every single camera that's going around, right? Stitching then becomes amazingly more complex. And I'll take you slowly through the process. Now let's just say you get your shutters all synchronized, and whatever philosophy you're using for the shutters is also synchronized between cameras. So again, there's flying shutters and open and close shutters, spinning shutters, all kinds of stuff, right? But let's just say you got that all figured out and synced up. If during stitching you have any anomalies in stitching a bit of the overlap, because what happens is two cameras are side by side with each other in one of your spherical camera units, and there's about a 50% overlap between two lenses, and that allows them to edge blend these things together. If there is a hair of anomaly in stitching these things together, the 3D effect for that stitching line in your virtual reality playback, when you get the headset on, it starts to lose 3D automatically, right? So it just flattens on you for a split second. When that occurs, you lose the illusion and you lose the value of your work, right? So something to keep in mind as you start to try to develop this content. The other huge one is addressed by the Ozo, the OZO, made by Nokia. I'm going to talk about that camera a little bit, and then this thing called the Jaunt 1. The Ozo is geared at your headset resolution. It's like 2K per eye, which is pretty darn good. There's no need to go over 2K because the headsets, when they're magnified with those lenses, can't give you 2K to begin with, right? But they found out that when a lens is taking in a lot of light, obviously it's and a lot of pixel movement, right? The processor that's handling that image is working overtime from perhaps a lens that's off to the left that is grabbing nothing but black pixels or very little movement at all, right? As each lens heats up and heats up against the temperature of other lenses, the problem is that the actual glass that is the lens catching the light can heat up. And again, it starts to create light distortion, right? Anytime you have a fraction of light distortion, you have two choices. You make it up in software correction, which means you're going to have to measure the lens constantly. Every single frame that's happening, you're measuring the distortion potential in the lens. Maybe just knowing that the lens is made of a certain amount of glass. When it bends a certain way, there's a certain lookup table that says when this lens is at 30 degrees Celsius, it's bending this much, and when it's at 10 degrees Celsius, it's at its factory spec, right? And then you could run anti-distortion algorithms against that to make sure that the stitching process works great, right? But what these guys have done is try to reduce any stitching that needs to occur, any stitching changes that need to occur from distortion. They have a liquid cool center of most of these cameras, and they will distribute the cooling to the lenses that are getting hotter, making sure that they're just as distorted as the ones that aren't hot at all. Now, if the whole interior of the camera goes up in a uniform way, then all the lenses should be distorting in a uniform way. So even if the lenses flex, as long as they're all doing it at the same time, you're okay. So the Ozo has some pluses and some minuses. The super duper plus is that it's a 9-inch lightweight ball, and it's 9 inches because they wanted it to be the average size of a human skull, which is brilliantly designed, right? Their preview software is pretty much live. So even though you're looking at spherical cameras inside a product that allows you to preview it, which they have some proprietary software that does it, but you could stitch it nuke on set pretty darn quickly if you had a good processor. A lot of them are using the Mac Pro, those little cylinders, and they're using that to stitch it live. You have to have some pretty good horsepower to pull it in and put it together so you can see what you're doing. So that's nice. So you can get some pretty instantaneous dailies from what you're looking at. The only limitation, besides its 2K resolution, which again, it's geared towards headsets, so it's not too bad, is that the color depth of the camera is 10-bit. And that is pretty low for today's standards, right? Most Photoshop you see is 32-bit, you know. At a minimum, you'd want 16-bit. So there's going to be a bit of a color palette degradation from reality. And again, your mind knows reality perfectly well. And so anything filmed with this, your mind's going to go through an adaptation of, well, okay, so the colors aren't quite reality. It's very, very close. 10-bit is not horrible, but 10-bit is something we haven't seen in computers for nearly 20 years. All right, we've been 16-bit for at least 20 years, 32-bit for most of it, which is a lot of overkill on that, but they had to go up to the next logical bit in memory, right? The Ozone is also, I believe, around $65,000, which seems incredibly high for this sort of experience. But you can now rent them from camera rental place. We have a place called Burns and Sawyer here in Los Angeles. You can just go rent one for a day and really get your chops down. And again, early adopters, people who get these cameras early, are going to be able to do things and get noticed in the next 6 months to a year, unlike you're going to be able to do this in 2 years when everyone's got one. It's probably $1,000, right? And believe me, Nokia is not sleeping on any of these specs. I'm telling you, they are on to their next camera and trying to resolve this issue, right? Again, once you increase the bit level of colors, let's just say you have a lot more processor cycles going on inside the camera, which potentially might actually heat up the interior even more. So that's part of why they limited it. Then you have a very amazing camera called the Jaunt 1. Just look it up in Google. Spell out 1, right? It is a much larger camera. It's probably about the size of an average pumpkin. It looks like a head on the end of one of those things in Matrix, one of the octopus heads, right? I believe it has 16 cameras all firing at 4K. So essentially you got 4K in every eyeball. This thing has the very same interior design, right? So it has all liquid cooled. It shoots in, I believe, a 32-bit palette. It's utterly photoreal when you see the final product. It's a 360 camera, obviously. But their post-process is much more involved. So you have 16 cameras running 16 memory cards, like the one I'm running in this camera right now, those little tiny chiclet cards, right? So when you open it up, you have 4 bays of 4. And you can put you have to put 4 little cards in every single one of them. And I believe they only have, I was trying to think. I think they only have 12 around the equator and 2 up and 2 down. I think that's the way it works. Don't quote me on that. Go look it up. But their post-process is a lot more involved. And so let's say you were able to get a hold of one of these cameras, and I'm willing to bet, I don't know what the price is. They say they're going to start renting them, but I'm willing to bet they're probably over $250,000 for one of these cameras. I could be wrong. I don't know. I have a friend that has a company that does nothing but shoot with this camera. So my information comes directly from him. But what happens is that you come home from your shoot and you pull out these cards and you take your little bay and you plug it into an apparatus that's hooked over the internet, and your entire shoot for that day goes up in 16 chunks, right? So you have 4, and then you do 4, and you do 4 and 4, and then if you have more shooting that you've done, it's these groups of 4 times 4, and you have to wait for everything to upload to the cloud. Within 24 hours, you get a pretty good low-resolution stitch of what you shot, and then over the next couple days, you get the actual super-duper high-res ones stitched down to you. And I'm not quite sure exactly why this sort of thing is cloud-based, but I think it has to do with the fact that they want to make sure that what you get back is what you want, and I'm sure they're changing the software second by second on the other side. So it's better that you have their latest and greatest technology on their end to make sure that what you get is what you're looking for, right? So if you want to shoot documentary stuff or live action stuff and you want it to be utterly photoreal for an IMAX theater, this is the camera you would use currently, right? I don't believe there's a competitor that's over the Jaunt that I know of. It's June 2016, just in case you guys are watching this a lot later than the day I record it. But better believe Jaunt 1 is a strategic name, because Jaunt 2 will come out and it'll be even more amazing, right? Now, some of these cameras have a lot of limitations in places that you'd never know, right? So I told you about the ozone color bit limitation. And again, it'll convince your eye pretty good of what's going on. But again, you won't get pure color range. With the Jaunt, the limitation isn't the end of the world, but what happens is you have to be, I believe, 3 to 6 feet away from the camera at all times. Otherwise, the focal point of focus dies out. And so it's not built to focus on things really, really close. So if you wanted a character to come right up to the lens and look, it's going to shred the stitching process. It simply can't do it. And so they have to make design choices when they make these cameras. And luckily, virtual reality is usually about recreating a world, right? But imagine putting a Jaunt in the cockpit of a car. Well, a lot of components inside the cockpit of a car are within a 3-foot radius. and so you might not be able to do it, especially a steering wheel popping off. They've done jaunt filming where they had put it in the passenger seat of a car. And as the driver's driving and he reaches up to do something on the dashboard, his arm shreds as soon as it goes within that diameter of the camera. So definitely keep that in mind as well. All these things will be worked out eventually, but that one's going to have to be resolved probably at the optic level, because the data is simply missing inside the cameras to stitch anything together that you could see. But once they do fix this, man, you're going to get that crazy 3D where something pokes out at your face, right? It's going to be wild. Now, before we get into how to shoot VR content, I just want to give you a little teaser here. This is the kind of stuff I'm starting to teach now in LA. What is 3D today, right? Because a lot of people are not completely informed about how what you're buying and seeing in the movie theaters is actually created. You might be shocked to realize that virtually everything is being shot in 2D and it's going through a post 3D process. How does that work? And I'm talking about Star Wars Awakening was filmed in 2D film, right? And hats off to these guys paying Pacific Rim 2D. Guardians of the Galaxy was filmed in 2D. What they do is they take this 2D negative and they bring it into these special companies that knock it into 3D. They create inside a computer a representation of every object of significant value, right? So there might be a picture on the wall and they ignore it, right? There might be, there's just a bunch of different anomalies, I should say. But what ends up happening is the human body is sort of modeled crudely in 3D, and then the 2D plane projection goes onto this 3D environment. And then when you're looking through the 3D glasses, you start to see sort of a Viewmaster effect. Now, the two that I've seen in 3D recently was Pacific Rim first, and then I saw Guardians of the Galaxy second in 3D on a beautiful television, beautiful Sony. I can tell you that Pacific Rim's post 3D processing is way, way better than Guardians of the Galaxy. What you'll notice in these post 3D processes is essentially exaggerated 3D. And so you a couple times, I think it was the Guardians of the Galaxy, but even in Pacific Rim, when they started trying to do the body armor, when someone's sitting with you like I am today, mostly facing you, they get it pretty spot on because it's pretty easy. But when someone turns sideways and they want to do a big shoulder plate and an arm, whoever did this, the artist that did this, at times got it ridiculously exaggerated. And so it was popping out of the screen in a very inhumane, I shouldn't say inhumane, but unhuman way, right? A very non-realistic way. And your mind definitely picks up on it after a 2-hour movie especially. So the post 3D in Hollywood is sort of a button on the end of the costs to film something in 3D. The other one is that to film in real 3D is very challenging, and I'm not sure why. Okay, because they're not doing 360 panoramic stuff, right? They're just shooting a 2D frame straight out the camera. The two films that have recently been filmed in real 3D is Avatar 1 and Tron Legacy. Avatar 1, in my experience, is the most pure 3D experience I have seen through a television. Now, I saw it in the movie theater once in 2D, and then the second time I saw it in 3D, and it was just bad experience. Whatever it was, where I was sitting in the theater with the passive glasses that I was sitting with, it just was not good. When I saw it at my dad's house, and I'm not a guy to watch a movie a lot of times unless it's utterly phenomenal. And Avatar is definitely one of those experiences. I put the glasses on, and my mind was blown at how utterly perfect the 3D was, and I didn't understand why until I figured out that what I had been seeing in other films was this post-3D process. The camera that James Cameron used is, I forgot the name of it, but it's a real true 3D camera. And so all the live action stuff, everything in the rooms, it's where they were exactly. And of course, when we go to Avatar World, it's all 3D precise because it's rendered in a computer. So anytime you see a Pixar movie or any sort of Ice Age movie that claims to be in 3D, those negatives are perfectly in 3D. So there is nothing but perfection when you look through the lens and try to feel the dimension of this first experience. Again, it's not considered really virtual reality because it's not trying to shoot itself like VR, and it's not in perfect 3D, right? Most of the time. It's not surrounding you, I should say. But there was a limitation for those of you who are sort of into these kind of trivia things. You know, James Cameron spent 12 years developing and filming Avatar. And what this guy will do is he sort of works like Kubrick, or he works for a decade designing a film while he's filming other stuff, and by the time he gets into production, he has thought everything out on a massive scale. Some of you may be following this, but he's doing 2, 3, and 4 right now. And I'm willing to bet they're beautifully trilogy together, right? But he had designed every single shot he possibly could that was going to be in the real world with this big, giant, heavy camera to be pretty stationary. If you remember the movie, a lot of the shots are this guy, this Marine, taking home movies of himself, talking about his journey. Well, that meant the camera was fixed on a tripod, locked down to the set, and he just, experienced it. Anytime there's a move, it's pretty subtle when it's in the real world. Now, obviously, there are scenes where the things are composited together as well. Most of the sets are all 3D, but there's some stuff where it's mixing together. But you'll notice there's not a lot of camera moves. When Joe Kosinski shot Tron Legacy, he used this camera, and just as a traditional director, he wanted to do some pretty amazing shots because it's Tron, and he had planned a lot of camera movements. And then he finally saw the camera and realized this thing is massively heavy. It has to have a really substantial crane holding it in place, and so it simply can't move like a normal camera. It also is extremely loud as it runs, as I understand it. So everything obviously is audio dubbed in movies, right? But it's a little disturbing to the actors to try and hear each other when the camera is making more noise than they are. So a lot of the shots you see in Tron Legacy are really intense sweeping crane shots, and it's not because that was the lack of imagination of the director. It's just that that's all he could do with it in the time he had. Because it was sort of a surprise, this camera weighs a lot and it's really loud. So that technology has to optimize as well. And again, think about the spherical problem of the Jaunt 1 that they're probably going to end up solving, but you have a 3-foot diameter around, or radius, I should say, not diameter, radius around the camera that things will break in stitching. So that's sort of where Hollywood is today. Now let's say that you were interested in doing virtual reality filming yourself, and somehow you got one of these cameras in your purse, right? How do you film VR? And this is where this video is going to be very valuable because there's not a lot of people teaching this stuff right now. Again, I taught some of the very first classes on the internet back in the mid-90s when I was learning, and now it's just pathetic knowledge. But I'm going to give you an example of my experience with the internet so that you understand how valuable this information could be to you and how you could jump ahead of the rest, right? As I was learning the internet in 96, I wrote courses online about it, and it was so ahead of its time in explaining everything from design to basic HTML to basic what we called CGI back in the day, which essentially was the title for a script talking and doing something intelligent on the back end. MIT came by and found my course online and made it mandatory reading for all of their students. And so my hits on this site just blew up because their coursework required my coursework. I had several ISPs ask permission to duplicate my courses all over their websites at the time. And so this was like probably 4 years. In fact, the MIT thing happened around 98, 99. So it took a couple of years for them to find it, but it was such a thorough course that's how it used. And now, again, it is pathetic. It's what everyone knows about everything, and they're light years away from this tech that I was talking about back in the day. And quite frankly, there's better teachers out there nowadays too. And this is what's going to happen to what I'm about to tell you. This isn't really a course, but this is sort of a peek into what's going on. Now, when you're shooting a 3D environment, right, and or I should just say a 360 environment, the storytelling process changes quite a bit, right? And when you push it into stereo 3D, it gets even more complicated. I'm involved in a project right now where we're helping a young director film a very exciting franchise, which I can't talk about right now, but I spent 2 hours at a camera shop here in Los Angeles. It's one of the most popular rigging outfits in Los Angeles for all films. And we sat and designed, literally with all their parts and pieces everywhere in the room, all this gigantic warehouse full of all these cranes and dollies and tripods and armatures and that kind of stuff, and camera heads and all kinds of stuff, to design a shot for this particular piece we're working on. And as you might imagine, we have to film this thing in 3D. This first piece is going to go out in 2D, but it's 360. And so we have a burden of filling up the camera in all angles. Well, where do you put the camera? Where do you put the crew? How do you do this, right? Now, I'm going to get to some of those techniques in a second. But the other big one is, how do you choreograph your scene such that there is a reason to have this 360 thing around you? Now, the first 360 thing I ever saw was at Disneyland, and it was a trip to China. And they essentially drove a 360 mono camera all the way through China, all these different places. And you were in a 360 theater standing up, and you could look behind you, and what you saw was no one knew the camera was coming in most of the shots, but as soon as you turned around, you see everyone turn around, look at the camera. It was pretty cute. But in a theatrical way of filming stuff, you don't want that to happen at all. It's fiction all the way around you, right? Now, when you have a gimmick like 3D, you got to be careful. You're going to get into gimmicks really heavily at first, and then you're going to mature in the medium, and you're going to stop doing the gimmicks. I'm going to tell you right now, the 360 filming is pretty much a gimmick. What's not going to happen probably 10 years from now is no one's going to really try to tell a story behind the head, right? We don't want to be looking around behind us in a movie theater. Even if you have one of these Oculus, Rift, or the HTC Vive, or your Samsung Gear, you're going to be in your house, and it's going to be really neat for the first dozen experiences if you're lucky, right? But eventually you're going to get tired of this whole gimmicky thing, and you're going to only tell stories where it makes sense in these other spaces. Now, left and right's pretty awesome, right? Because that's not a big deal. Look left, look right. As long as it continues wrapping around, the illusion doesn't stop, right? But where do we experience reality? We experience reality straight out of our eyeballs. That's why we're made this way. In 3D, the projection box that you can see all of reality is called the frustum. When you are sitting at your home and looking at your television, you know that you can't see above and below the television, left or right of the television. So your frustum is pretty much the upper left, upper right, upper or lower left, lower right pixels of your eyeball sight straight to the edges of your TV. That's your frustum, right? And so that's where the story has to be told in the normal mono experience. When you get into virtual reality, you have a lot of choices, and it's almost too much at first. But we actually have a little bit of experience with some of this. I'm going to map two things in your brain that most of you have experienced. If you've ever played a video game where it had a first-person view, right? Either it's the gun in front of you, or you're doing a cutscene in a movie where it's out the eyeballs. Fallout 3 has a great cutscene where you're looking at the eyeballs, experiencing this vault world, and you don't really pop out of your body until you leave the vault, because they're doing all this narration. You know that even though you're staring at your monitor, which is a rectangle, you can move your mouse and strafe left and right? And it's a pleasant experience because you get to look around if someone's talking to you. You can pay attention to them, and they can pace around you to kind of draw your eye to everything that's in the room. If you pay artists to build a world, you're going to want to get your money's worth, right? Otherwise, why make anything behind the camera, right? Now, you can have a lot of directors probably make little tchotchkes behind you. Imagine you're in some Back to the Future type thing, and there's the flux capacitor kind of back to your left if you're the passenger, back to your right if you're the driver. That's going to be sort of an awkward look, but it'll be definitely worth it because there's the flux capacitor, man. And if you love the franchise, you'll do anything to see it operating, right? Especially in 3D. But what do we do in normal cinema? We do a ton of cuts. A Michael Bay movie's cutting every split second, right? Well, you can't cut a real world. Our real world doesn't cut, So how do you handle cuts in 3D, especially in a virtual reality surround environment? I will tell you that one of the most graceful things on the eye that works really, really well is just a cross dissolve. And you could even be moving at the time, right? So the camera could be moving and you just blend into the next shot. That's another way of doing it. What you probably won't do is zoom up on someone's face. So tight shots are going to be very conservative situations. And because these cameras can't do close proximity filming, if you're going to bring anything into your shot really close to the camera, you're probably going to be rendering that in 3D to make sure it's in focus, which again costs a lot of money depending on what you're putting in front of the camera, right? Another thing is the movement of the camera is very, very delicately done, okay? Now, when we shake our head left and right, we get motion blur. Even though you may not notice it, that's what happens. But when you do this in a camera, you really get a lot of motion blur, and they've actually worked very hard in Hollywood inside 3D packages to create motion blur to mimic reality. The problem is that when the image blurs, you immediately lose the stereoscopic image, meaning you don't have a left eye and a right eye that has any discernible depth in it. So if you move really, really fast in a virtual reality and you create motion blur of any kind, the illusion goes away. It goes flat. So you got to make sure you probate that kind of movement. Another one that's interesting that we've discovered, and a lot of people are discovering this, is that roll. When you roll left or roll right, it doesn't matter how slow you do it. It makes everybody want to puke really, really fast. It doesn't matter how high resolution it is. Doesn't matter what the frame rate is. Rolling is a pukey situation. And it's because as human beings, we are upright on our own tripod, our bipod, right? And we don't roll our heads too much. And even when we do, just roll your head looking anywhere in the room that you are right now. You'll notice that your brain pretty much stabilizes the image inside your head as a perfectly flat plane, right? There's this funny thing when you take chickens and you hold them and you get them to focus on something and you move their body up and down a few inches. You watch a chicken head and the chicken head is perfectly motionless because that is his autonomic system making sure that the visual cortex inside the chicken stays informed. It doesn't get, pukey, disoriented. So when you're designing a shot for a virtual reality environment, the best thing you could probably do is draw a circle and put your camera as a dot in the center of that circle. Now, again, if you want to make sure you don't create any choreography that blows up your 3D camera, you're going to have to draw the radius around the camera that is the focal point of focus, where the stitching software doesn't die, right? And then you're going to have to keep things away from your main character because you're usually telling it from the eyeballs of the main character if you're doing that sort of thing. Soaring over California, if you've ever been to California Park and Disneyland, they have this ride that's you flying over California a lot in different locations, and it's a very pleasant experience. It's in a dome that's tilted forward. So that's your first illustration of your set, is this circle. At that point, you probably want to draw a halfway line of 180 degree of your cylinder within that circle and say, that's really where my story exists. Now, if any of you have dabbled in filming or you've seen the making of a film, you'll know that when you look at the director looking at the dailies or looking at the live preview of the shot, they'll have a monitor that's 16 by 9 sort of aspect ratio, but they will have drawn on the monitor a rectangle inside the rectangle. And what that's for is the director of photography, the DP, and the director are trying to make sure that everything that's important is in that inner rectangle because you don't want to get too close to the edges, because that's where you get sort of edge violations. You wouldn't want someone's face to be half on unless you're really trying to make that experience as part of your story. So the same thing goes for virtual reality in that we have up and down limitations, but we also have sort of the panoramic limitations. Again, the more you get close to your 180 degree, if you want to say that 0's to your right and 180 is to your left, that's probably a little extreme on your edge violations in terms of where the story should be. So you pull that in, 140 degrees to 140 degrees right in front of you from center, right? So you want to make sure that you're telling the story primarily in front of the person, and that you sort of keep track and sort of sanction moving the action behind the character especially, which is you, the viewer, right? And if you're going to go left and right, it should probably be like a secondary piece of your story. And I'll give you an example. If there's a Star Wars, let's say Star Wars 8 goes out and it, or even 9 goes out and it's in virtual reality, surround cameras, which is going to be probably too soon for that to happen. But who knows what happens in 6 years, right? They're going to have a space battle in front of you, right? And they're going to really be careful about rolling the camera, which happens a lot in television 2D because it doesn't make you puke. They're going to tell the main story out in front of you. Now, if they want to take advantage of the fact they've spent all this money on a virtual reality rig, what'll happen is if a TIE fighter or an X-Wing fighter wants to get into this other space, it'll be a secondary unit that's already done its main attack, right? You know, at Star Wars, they always have like, you're coming right out of ship and someone blows it up from behind and then flies by you, right? So it's going to be taking those secondary characters and flying them behind you, and that will feel extremely real. And again, if you want to turn around, I'm sure there's going to be something there for you. But again, it can't be a mandatory part of the story unless you're extremely careful about how you do that. But use your experience in video games, the cutscenes in video games where it's a first-person view, to figure out what has worked in the past. Now, the other thing that everyone's figuring out really quickly after they tell someone else they can film a 360 experience, whether it be mono or stereo, is that they have to erase the crew. They have to erase all the equipment in the room, which again was something that was for free and all the theatrical content from Charlie Chaplin up to today, right? You can have a huge crew behind you. You know, there's a lot of Twilight Zones and stuff where they'll actually turn the camera around and show the whole crew because it's part of the story. We no longer can do that. And so your challenge is, because all the imagery has to stitch together perfectly, you have, well, you know, we can shoot a plate backwards with nothing there, and then we can shoot the whole thing forward and then stitch the back to the front plate. Here are your challenges, all right? Lighting is your bane of existence when you're trying to stitch different time frames together in a cylindrical 360 environment, right? So let's just say you think, well, that's no problem. I'm just going to lock all my lights in. We're going to set them up. We're going to lock the camera to the ground. Nothing's going to move. The lights aren't going to change their luminosity, right? So it's all going to stitch together fine. All right. Then you move something in the environment for your primary take. When you move something in the environment, you are creating lumen splashes everywhere, right? Light splashes off people's outfits. People block light. And so you might have a backplate that's fully lit with no characters in it. But when someone tries to walk a 360, then you got a big problem there. But you also have the choreography of someone blocking light in the front, and all of a sudden you've got a full light cast behind you, but it's not seamlessly blending in with the shadow of someone else in the foreground of the shot. And so you're going to get into a lot of anomalies trying to stitch all this stuff together. So Hollywood and the special effects industry is working overtime to try and figure out better camera rigging environments, right? They're trying to figure out better software. They're trying to figure out techniques. Again, if you're telling a full 3D computer rendered movie, none of this stuff's going to be a problem. And so that's probably where you're going to see a lot of penetration. But if any of you have dabbled in 3D software, you'll know that that's extremely time-consuming, extremely expensive, and there's only a few studios in the world that would have the capacity of creating this type of experience. And then where are you going to go to see it? And are you really going to pay for it to see it through your telephone or through a Riff or a Vive, right? Chances are probably not for a while, right? So we don't really have the environments to go see this stuff in. So it's going to be another sort of challenge. Another little hidden expense that comes into play, and cinemas, or sorry, I shouldn't say this, studios and 3D effects outfits are already learning this in a really big way. Let's say someone says, you know, we're going to make this movie so realistic, and they're a 3D outfit, right? They're Pixar or something, and they're like, man, we're going to make this happen. And you got an IMAX theater that can shoot, that can project between 6K and 12K negatives, right? And so you have a couple challenges on your hand. Any of you are familiar with 3D productions know that they model these things on a computer, they animate them, they rig them, they do mocap, all this crazy stuff, and then they send it off to a render farm, which is the big farm of computers that makes the frame that you see on your television or in the movie theater. And they are casting every ray of light and watching it bounce off all these objects, and it's ridiculously realistic today, right? No problem, right? Now imagine someone says, I want to take a 4K negative and push it up to 8K. Well, automatically, it's more than double the pixels, right? It's incredibly. It's like, Steve Jobs used to do these presentations. When he said that the resolution on a monitor went up, he made you realize that when you increase a monitor size, you're potentially duplicating your pixel count by three more than your original negative. Right, so it'd be 4K, 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 4K. And so it's very expensive now all of a sudden to make the render farms render more pixels. And even the software that takes low resolution negatives and makes them positive, or makes them high resolution negatives, same level of increased expense. Now, so let's take you back down to 2K and now stretch that 360. So remember that frustum idea I told you, right? You have a left and a right that you're very accustomed to with your televisions at home. Now stretch that 360 degrees around you. You could be over 4 times the amount of pixels. Just keeping it at a 2K negative, you got 2K, 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 4 times, probably almost 5 times around you, depending on what the average ratios of the screen you're looking at. So all of a sudden now, the cost of rendering the negative goes through the roof. If anybody wants to say, oh, it'll be great, it'll be 4K content. Okay, 4K times this panoramic surface. If somebody wants to create a dome where they're going to bring it up and over your head, well, then you got to render all these pixels up above. So now your negative gets massive. If they want to curve the dome down underneath the audience so that you can't see it. So it's just virtual reality right out the door. The only thing you can see is the back of the head and the person in front of you, maybe the chairs you're sitting in. That's it. Massive size negative. And so if you go out and you see high resolution 360 experiences in your lifetime, you need to understand that the amount of processor power to create these experiences is incredible. And so the obvious upgrade that needs to occur is a couple fold, right? We got to make these render farms 10 times as powerful as they are today. And luckily they are getting more powerful as time passes. Every single second that goes by, someone makes a bigger one and a bigger one. We have render farms now on Amazon. We have render farms on Google Clouds that make everything happen as well. But the other one is the very format of transmitting this between devices. And so movie theaters today will often get either a disc or they'll just drag it offline. They get these big files that to transmit every night to the cinemas. Okay, we'll take your average 2K negative and then do it in some sort of wraparound. It's going to get massive, right? So the very bandwidth that's required to download the movie is going to have to increase to handle that. So you see how this gets incredibly complicated. Now here's the good news. If any of you can figure this stuff out, if you can find a market that wants it, an advertiser, a studio, whether it be an indie film of yours, right now you can pretty much film your living room. As long as you can get it in super duper high def, you could film your living room and people will download and watch it. And they may not pay for it, right? But if you can play with any of this stuff, even if you're using a GoPro unit, which is a lot cheaper than these other units I'm talking about, and just get familiar with telling stories in this three-dimensional space, which we would say is a surrounding sort of virtual reality experience, you may be able to do what I did in computers, which is pass up a lot of the film schools that are struggling right now to upgrade their curriculums to teach this stuff. A buddy of mine and I have developed a syllabus that we're trying to get in one of the major film schools here in Los Angeles, and they're panting for this content, right? Now, the nice thing about going to school versus me just telling you this is that at a school, they will most likely buy a screen that you can see this in. They're going to have the headsets there for that you don't have to buy. You're going to have the software and the hardware all ready to go. So as we teach this kind of stuff, we're like, okay, get your cameras out, run outside and film something. and then come inside and you can immediately stitch it together, immediately put in your special effects and see what you have, right? So that's the benefit of schooling. But for those of you who are tenacious, I know you guys will find a way to do it on a shoestring budget. And again, you could pretty much pile into this thing. Now, that's all predicated on the idea that VR sticks this time around. I think it will stick. I think it will stick because I think that the software is there, I think the hardware is there, and I think the processing power is there. Our only challenge is trying to make sure that the venues exist to see the content, right? Your friends aren't going to go buy $700, $800 headsets anytime soon, right? That's a PlayStation plus several games, or that's a brand new PC. I do like the fact that these proprietary headsets like Oculus and Vive actually require that people own desktop computers. Because if you've ever seen my episode on post-PC era or the fanboys, you'll know that they are trying to kill the concept of you owning a piece of hardware at your house that actually makes creating real entertainment experiences happen, right? You're not going to be able to do this stuff on a tablet or a phone for a very long time. And even if it could, you want the biggest surface to view this on, right? So you want the biggest screen you can see so that you can understand what you're doing. Obviously, it's going to be very challenging. Even if you bought a really expensive curved monitor, it's going to be very challenging to tell the story in a 360 way if you can't see it, right? So editing these things together is going to be, for now, it's going to be a lot of artists sitting with these headsets on, looking around to make sure that the shots are there. Or they're going to have some software that can rotate the stage so that even though we're looking forward into a screen, we can see what's behind, and so we can tour it around. A lot of people are going to be very nauseous editing this stuff together. So the fuse has been lit. The interest is there. I would think that $150 billion would be plenty of money to get this thing off the ground, but a lot of companies launder money through faux projects, or you just get a bunch of white shirts getting involved. One of the challenges with virtual reality right now is that you do have a lot of investors raising tremendous amounts of money, but not hiring anyone from Hollywood to make sure that the uses of the hardware is really there. So content providers for virtual reality are very slim right now, right? Again, there's a lot of gimmicky folks out there, but there's not a lot of folks really engaging the theatrical storytelling and trying to find where the story should be and what little chotskis could be a result of having the story all around you, right? I know you feel me. So this is the replacement for the other very lightweight virtual reality episode. Again, I'm going back over some of these episodes of my first season, replacing them because I just think that they were crap. This is one that's not at me for quite a while. The other one I'm probably going to replace is the Mars mission hoax because I got so many facts incorrect that you have to watch it in YouTube and turn on annotations to really see the true facts of what I was talking about. So we need to clean that up. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. If you haven't already, go to mkultraradio.com. As always, you can find the feed to everything, all the Facebook links to stuff. We have 2 shows. One is more intense, is sort of offline right now, but we think in the next coming weeks we're going to be able to do our more topical show as the world has changed recently, which I won't talk about because it'll date this episode too badly. But I hope you found this valuable. If you have any other questions about virtual reality, please put it in the comments. It could be that I do a part 2 on this, if I can come up with another hour's worth of content, but that's only going to be driven by you guys. So I know you feel me. As always, take care of yourself and somebody else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.